Great. Well, I'm going to go ahead and get us started so that we can make the best use of our time here. Um, Thank you to everyone for joining us. My name is Louise Bedsworth with the Center for Law, Energy, and the Environment, here with my colleagues Catherine Hoff and Malcolm Johnson. And we have been working on a series of webinars and pieces of policy work focused on community benefits. And this webinar today is an element of that series where we're bringing together speakers to share with us experiences from place-based investment programs and initiatives across California, and bringing those into this conversation around community benefits agreements. I will start us off today and share a few slides, and then we will turn to our speakers. So I'm gonna Great. So today's conversation is really broadening our conversation around community benefits to draw in lessons from folks who are doing this work on the ground at the policy scale, both at the state and national level, but really then also at a very local level to think about how do you actually do the work of realizing meaningful community benefit through investment programs, but also through how you do coalition building and collaboration. I will start just with a few logistics for today. For folks who are here, we will be recording this webinar. We will share that out with everyone who has registered and then post it on our website as well as soon as we have all of the captioning and everything complete. We'll also be taking notes on today's conversation and can be sharing out some of those summary notes as well as resources that are mentioned or shared throughout the conversation today. Would ask folks who are attending to place questions into the Q&A chat function, or sorry, not the chat function, the Q&A function in the webinar, and then we will do all of the questions at the end. We can certainly try to do some clarifying as needed in written form, but to enable more conversation and dialogue, we will, especially among the panelists, have a larger Q&A session at the end. And then we'll use the chat function to share different resources throughout the presentations today. Just to put this conversation into context, I want to share a little bit about what CLE has been doing in thinking about community benefits agreements, specifically in offshore wind development, but then also why we are taking this conversation today to really, we're broadening it a little bit. In earlier this year in May, we and really all throughout this year, we have been focusing our work in offshore wind development on community benefits agreements as a key element of implementation of projects in California. We've been focusing a lot of our work in the Central Coast, which is one of the 2 lease areas in the state, and having a lot of focused conversations there, focusing on broadly what CBAs are. And then we've been also at a convening to provide examples of CBAs or community benefits agreements. In June of this year, we published a policy brief that provided some examples of community benefits agreements in offshore wind and what that can look like for California. And then in this conversation, we're focusing on lessons that can be drawn from place-based investments and initiatives in California. The reason we chose to focus in on community benefits agreements in this work is because there's going to be a tremendous amount of investment that is made in offshore wind, but a number of associated in climate infrastructure projects. Increasingly, the federal government, where a lot of the funding will come from, has focused on community benefits agreements as key elements of those investments. And so we see a big opportunity to use community benefits agreements as a way to realize meaningful benefits in communities so that they truly benefit from the energy transition, and I think can potentially really have an impact on how we're making those investments and doing in a way that centers community vision, values, and priorities, and be a vehicle to really bring communities along in the transition, whether that's from thinking through jobs and workforce development, other types of investment in community around community resilience, or other benefits, but also in how the community organizes to help realize those benefits through coalition building, capacity building. And so we really see a lot of opportunity here. So in the conversation today, we will not be talking really specifically about offshore wind, but really just thinking more generally about climate investment as an opportunity to realize community benefits. So I sort of already touched on this and sort of why we want to think about CBAs and place-based strategies, but just to step back, community benefits agreements are legally binding and enforceable contracts, and they are signed by project developers and then other, stakeholders in the community, often a community-led coalition. And within community benefits agreements, there are opportunities to really articulate a set of specific benefits that communities want to see. Typically, they are a tool that is used to gather support for that investment. And I think so that's sort of how, and they've been around for quite some time. These are not new in this context. I think what we can bring in from the place-based strategies side is that place-based approaches to investment, which the state of California has increasingly employed, tailor how projects are developed to local contexts and conditions. They often prioritize impacted communities, so those that have high levels of pollution, economic disadvantage, and often they include not just the infrastructure investment, but different capacity building activities. So by bringing together these two conversations, what we really want to think about is the what of the investment. So what is happening, but then also how do you sort of build infrastructure around that at the community scale that can help to realize a successful infrastructure investment, but one that brings along and has community as part of that. So in today's discussion from our panelists, we're going to hear we're not going to hear about specific programs in a siloed way, but in many cases, these initiatives draw from or are part of a couple of different state investment programs and or community-led efforts. So in the handout that was sent around prior to today's webinar, we focused on 4 examples, 3 of which are state investment programs, and the 4th that I kind of will put into a community-led initiative. But I just want to touch briefly on, I think, 3 really strong examples that are coming out of the state right now in place-based investment. The first is the Transformative Climate Communities Program. This is a program that is administered by the California Strategic Growth Council and was developed in state legislation in 2016. So it's been around for about 7 years, has made investments in over 10 different communities. And that program takes an integrated and makes an integrated investment in infrastructure projects at a neighborhood scale. There are some very unique aspects of that program, which that the community develops a vision for transformation. It's intended to really be a catalytic program and a set of goals, and matches the project investments to realizing that vision and goals. Within that program, there's a requirement for a collaborative stakeholder structure that provides a mechanism for coordination, for oversight, and accountability for that project. And there are 3 transformative elements. One is a displacement avoidance or anti-displacement strategy to ensure benefits accrue to residents and businesses in the investment area, workforce and economic development, and climate adaptation and resilience. That program also has a comprehensive evaluation framework, which is something you'll see is common across these examples. The next program that the state has launched just more recently is something called Regional Climate Collaboratives. And this really drew from the Transformative Climate Communities program and thinking about how do we make an investment in community capacity and coalition building. And so this is an investment program that invests in a collaborative structure or network. It is not necessarily tied to infrastructure as much as it is to investing in that sort of what I think of as the soft infrastructure, really the community organizing, the capacity building, building and leveraging local expertise um, to develop and support and access additional investment in the community. So the collaboratives all have a shared vision and partnership agreement. And then they are building plans that are actionable, that focus on social infrastructure, they're equity centered and community centered, with the idea that they can better access then investments in the community. And then the third is the Community Economic Resilience Fund, or SERF. SERF grew out of a suite of really funding that came in through the pandemic, but with an eye to thinking about building regional economic resilience to support the transition to a low carbon economy. And so in this case, the state has been making planning grants in state identified regions. So in the first two, transformative climate communities and regional climate collaboratives, the state does not define the area. The community really builds that up to say this is the neighborhood or this is the collaborative that we will be building. In the case of SERF, there are 13 state identified regions, but then with the investment, the regions develop an economic development strategy that is informed by local context and existing plans. Again, there's an evaluation component to this program with focused on inclusion, job equity, how responsive the planning and the projects are to climate responsiveness, and then community resilience. So ultimately, there will be funding that would come into the SERF collaboratives for projects that are consistent with the strategy. But each region right now is building that economic development strategy. And then finally, these programs, of course, didn't come out of nothing. These programs were really driven by a need that was seen because local communities at all different scales, from a very local neighborhood scale to regional scale, we're seeing the kind of organizing that is happening, that is coming together, that was saying to the state, we know what we need. Don't and specifically, if we want to implement a plan, these are the kinds of things we need. And sometimes that's very challenging to do because the state programs can be quite siloed. And so we have seen a lot of work over a very long stretch of time at a local level where we see different collaboratives or other organizing structures forming. One example, and we'll hear today from the North Coast Resource Partnership, which is part of the Alliance of Regional Collaboratives for Climate Adaptation. This is a network of collaboratives that are advancing resilience at a regional scale. These are locally formed and led, so they look different in each region, with a shared set of guiding principles across the network of collaboratives. Of course, there are many examples that have come out of different communities where you have these locally driven collaboratives. In many cases, those groups are accessing funding through programs like Transformative Climate Communities or the Region Climate Collaboratives or SERF, or are plugging into those programs. So this is really a process that is happening from a bottom up, really ground-led, sort of stakeholder-driven, community-driven action. And then you have state programs that are really coming in to try to meet that work. As we look across some of these place-based examples, there are a number of common characteristics, and we'll hear a bit about these today, which is really that they center community vision. Each of these are really driven by what is it that a community needs and wants to accomplish and achieve. And so the programs and policies and activities fit a specific context. And they take advantage of local strengths, knowledge, expertise, and resources. And they are tangibly advancing outcomes that are going to take advantage of that, but that are the outcomes that a community or a place has determined, or the outcomes they want to see. And so that community vision and building that community vision is a critical piece of place-based investment. And so one thing we'll hear about today is how is that work done and what does that look like? And that can also be something that can translate into a community benefits agreement context of what would you want to accomplish and how could something like a community benefits agreement help to accomplish that? The other common factor is collaborative structures. So you have to figure out what are the ways in which you work together, which different organizations work together, and how do they collaborate. And so this is elements of sort of meaningful engagement and partnership, and sort of how are you using techniques to inform, to learn, but also to empower different community members or different stakeholders, or a collaborative structure overall, and ensuring that there's strong engagement and reciprocity. So this is not a one-way relationship. These are back and forth, and that there's accountability and transparency. And so each of these examples, we'll hear a little bit about how does that work and what does that look like, from a very, like, what are the mechanics of that, to then also, what is the sort of structures around doing that. Another key feature here that I think is important to point out is that these types of approaches are very integrated, and so you're really looking to address multiple goals. And so if you're doing a project, it could be a transportation project or a housing project or an offshore wind development or a large scale renewable project, where you're looking to install a certain amount of capacity or something like that. But how do you really think about that investment to advance multiple goals, and really leveraging that to address a set of integrated priorities? And so really thinking about built natural, sort of how you're building linkages across the built natural and social systems. And so often this is around linking that infrastructure to operations and to programs, so that you can achieve a set of environmental benefits, but also economic and societal benefits. Finally, the common element on all of these programs, and particularly that we've seen at the state level, is a focus on comprehensive and integrated evaluation. And so how are we measuring and tracking the outcomes of these types of investments? And so Transformative Climate Communities really took a leadership role in building out on the state side what an evaluation plan could look like, and every site has an evaluation program that is being implemented and led by a group that each community selects to do that. And then they tailor the outcomes to the local priorities and values. And it's a set of both quantitative and qualitative measures to track those outcomes. So all of those pieces really come together in doing this kind of place-based work. And I think we can start to learn from those processes to think about how could you take a community benefits agreement and community benefits agreement process in the context of a large-scale climate investment, and think about how we can utilize that to achieve similar types of outcomes, to advance a local vision and goals, to think about how do we measure and track outcomes, and think in a very integrated way about how these transformative investments that are a key part of our energy transition can really be helping to bring communities along with them. So with that, I am really thrilled today that we have 4 incredible panelists who have agreed to spend time and share with us their experience. We're going to start with Kate Gordon, who is a visiting scholar at the Haas School of Business at Berkeley, but also former senior advisor to the Secretary of Energy, and then also did work in the Newsom administration as the director of the Governor's Office of Planning and Research, and as a senior policy advisor to Governor Newsom. And so has experience from the state and the federal level around how we're really building these programs, why they're important, and thinking about how community benefits fit into the context of these transformative or these investments. We'll then hear from Karen Gaffney, who's the Director of Strategic Planning and Communications for the North Coast Resource Partnership, which is one of the regional collaboratives in the state of California that is really helping to integrate a vision and strategy in the North Coast of the state. Next, we'll then hear from Dr. Wilma Franco, who's the Executive Director of the Southeast Los Angeles Collaborative and the recipient of one of the first regional climate collaboratives grants, but has been working in Southeast Los Angeles as a founding executive director of this collaborative, and really working on how do you do build that collaborative structure. And so I've been working on that for the last several years. And then finally, we'll hear from Anne Rogan, who's the CEO of Edge Collaborative and has been working at a local scale, especially in the Stockton and northern San Joaquin Valley region, to think about how do you build the collaborative structures to realize economic development and environmental outcomes in a region. So we'll go through each of the speakers, and then I'll help to transition between them. But we will start off with Kate Gordon. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing and I will turn it over to Kate. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Louise. It's great to see everybody. What an amazing group of people to be on a panel with. I am going to share my screen. And let me just say that I am going to be talking mostly about, and tell me if you can see that actually, because I can't see it. Yeah, okay. Let's make it, there we go. I'm going to be talking mostly about these issues from the federal level, as Louise said. Really, how does the policy environment help to create the conditions for and the support for the kind of work that others on the panel.
Oh, one note, right now I'm seeing this in like a presentation mode if others are seeing that.
Oh, are you? Okay, hold on. Yeah. Let me fix that. Thank you.
Like, I think it's this, I'm seeing the speaker view.
Is that better? Did that work? Did that fix it?
Yes. Perfect.
Thanks. Yeah, I have two screens, so I think it was just showing the other one. Thank you so much for noting that. So talking from a federal level, policy creating the conditions for the actual work on the ground, which you'll be hearing about today. I did have the honor of working with Louise at the state level on all three of the programs that she highlighted from the state. So really excited to hear more about how those are actually working, but talking now at the federal level. And I wanted to start with a little bit of context of why the Biden-Harris administration is so focused on this question of ensuring that there are really strong benefits and harm mitigation in communities and workers with this energy transition and these new investments. And that really stems from just the significant nature of these investments. This is my Google search recently of like, what does a clean energy future look like? And I sometimes think that we have in our heads these, rolling hills and a couple of wind turbines and that's very pretty and it does look like that in some places, but actually there is a lot behind that. The technologies behind the clean energy future are not always as pretty. They tend to be very industrial. Critical mineral mining, which is necessary for all of the technologies we're talking about, EV manufacturing, the sheer amount of transmission. I think it's been noted by Princeton that 80% of the benefits of the Inflation Reduction Act will not be realized without significant, maybe doubling of our transmission capacity. Carbon removal, direct air capture, these are the sort of technologies behind the curtain. And because they're so significant in places, how they are brought to places is really important. They're also significant. You could ask, why do we have to do all that stuff? Why don't we just do it all offshore? There's a few important reasons for that. One is that the federal government has to think about, one is geopolitical. We currently get most of our critical minerals, for instance, from other countries. Many of those countries, if you look at the Democratic Republic of Congo, you look at China, North Korea, are countries where we have complicated relationships from a national security standpoint. Those supplies could be cut off for political reasons at any time. So developing independence is really important. We also just have the reality that, emissions as a metric, just lowering emissions doesn't always create equity outcomes. This is a chart of California. You've all seen this. Our GDP has gone up while our emissions have gone down, but so has our inequality gone up as emissions have gone down. I'm not saying they're related, but I am saying that unless you pay direct attention in policy to things like quality job creation, things like direct benefits in communities, they are not an automatic outcome of emissions reduction. So we really do need to start looking at new metrics, which is something the Biden-Harris administration has fully committed to doing, moving from this sort of technocratic best widget at the best price approach, to clean energy and the energy transition, to much more of a place-based and a people-based approach to the transition. Louise talked about what place-based means. I think most of the people on this webinar know it. This is the DOE, Department of Energy, where I was for 2 years, slide on place-based, and many of the same elements that Louise just talked about. What is the place? What are the challenges and opportunities? So sort of the asset mapping, and then real community engagement of active partners and participants, a systems approach that's integrated, and of course, constant learning and adaptation, all critical elements of the administration, and particularly Department of Energy, taking that approach. These are just a few of the sort of examples of the president taking a place-based approach through key executive orders early on in his tenure, particularly for this context, the Tackling the Climate Crisis at Home and Abroad executive order, which created both the Justice 40 initiative with a focus on disadvantaged communities and the Interagency Work Group on Coal and Power Plant Communities with a focus on energy transition, a number of others as well. So, that's the president. The administration's fully committed. Behind all that commitment is a huge amount of new spending. The bipartisan infrastructure law, massive amount of spending on the foundational infrastructure required for the clean energy transition, including huge investments in demonstration projects like direct air capture, like the hydrogen hubs, like the small modular reactors in some places. You also see a huge amount of investment just in basic transmission, which is and in EV charging, both critical infrastructure pieces. Much of this, 62 billion of this funding straight to the Department of Energy, which is why those programs are so important. You also have the Inflation Reduction Act, super complicated bill. I'm not going to try to break it down right now, but I did want to say that within all these tax credits, loans, manufacturing grants, all of this, individual mandates, individual grants, are some strong focuses on place-based approaches, tax adders in the tax credit program for energy communities, those transition communities, for low-income communities, for projects using domestic products, for apprenticeships, for prevailing wage. There's targeted loans in the loan program office for repurposing existing infrastructure, which can have real community benefits. And then, of course, a significant amount of direct support for the first time ever for environmental justice communities. So both the infrastructure bill and the IRA really take a place-based approach, but at a very high level. It then becomes the role of the agencies, and particularly Department of Energy, playing a huge role in both bipartisan infrastructure law or bill and IRA in implementation. So the key question became for us, working with the secretary, how do we ensure that there actually are benefits to the extent possible, given the constraints from these bills in the projects that we're funding, these billions and billions of dollars of projects? The way that the Department of Energy, and I led this work while I was at the department, focused on this was through a new requirement called community benefits plans. We created this requirement for the infrastructure bill funding, which is some of it's formula funding, which is harder for the federal government to actually affect, frankly, because it runs through state, local, tribal governments. But for the direct competitive grants directly from the Department of Energy, those are big ones. The hydrogen hubs, for instance, is one most people know about, and California just got one. We required that the companies receiving the money, so Congress directed these funds for us to spend the funds on companies to create these projects. We then turned around and said, companies, as you're applying, you have to tell us your community benefits plan, and that will be 20% of your application. This is a first of its kind requirement, not only at the Department of Energy, but in general across the federal government. In requiring the community benefits plan, we said you need to look at 4 intersecting areas. What's the impact on disadvantaged communities as defined by Justice 40, and how are you mitigating harm to those communities? How are you ensuring diversity, equity, access, and inclusion across the project? That's workforce, that's contractors, that's the whole project. How are you ensuring quality job creation, not just number of jobs, but quality of jobs? And then the fourth, which actually isn't written here, which should be, which brings all those together, is how are you actually showing meaningful engagement with community and workers? Not just the classic, we gave money to the Boys and Girls Club, but how are you actually ensuring meaningful benefits? We asked for a specific, measurable, assignable, realistic, and time-based or SMART milestones per budget period to ensure that these weren't just throwaway lines in the proposals, but actual commitments. If the projects are selected, the department actually incorporates those commitments into the project contract, which means they're tied to the funding from the Department of Energy and tied to the ongoing evaluation process. Community benefits plans, I want to be really clear here, are an umbrella term. They are not the same as a community benefits agreement. So community benefits plans is an umbrella term at the department for both and either specific commitments from the company itself, making promises to DOE around wages and benefit amounts, partnerships, hiring specialists, direct support to groups, ongoing community advisory functions, et cetera. They also include what we think of when we think community benefits agreement, negotiated enforceable agreements with communities or workers, like community benefits agreements, impact and benefits agreements, which is what they're called in Canada and part of the Northern United States, good neighbor agreements, project labor agreements. These are the gold standard. You will get full credit. You will essentially get full points for the community benefits plan. If you do a negotiated enforceable agreement, they're the highest standard. They are not required though, and that is honestly because they can't be legally required. The Department of Energy and the federal government cannot require private companies to enter into other private contracts with other parties. So this was a way that we tried to elevate these as much as possible, and I'm sure others will talk about the importance of that. I want to also say, and I'm just about done, but I did want to say, for the companies, I want to be really clear. This is not just the federal government sort of saying, here's a whole bunch more things you need to do. I think Ezra Klein has called this a everything bagel approach, where you sort of load things on to projects because they're important values. We wanted to make really clear, and the secretary has been really clear, that meaningful community and worker engagement and community benefits actually reduce project risk. They reduce the risk of opposition and delay. They maximize benefits to the community, to workers. They ensure the long-term success that the project is done well, and they build durable support for implementation. In particular, as we're building out these very industrial systems, they can reduce permitting and siting times because they're done really in collaboration with communities. And this is the secretary talking about the importance of bringing all of those values and pieces into the process. So much more to say, but I'm respecting time here. I did want to say there's a lot of resources on the DOE website about community benefits. The White House's Climate and Economic Justice Screening Tool is where you find more information about how Justice 40 intersects with this, which is critically important. It's one of the few ways that Justice 40 is actually written into project implementation. And then there's an entire website on energy transition communities as well, of which we have several here in California. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing and go back to Louise.
Great. Thank you so much, Kate. That was terrific. That was a super helpful overview and sort of helped put this into context. Since now we're going to shift gears to hear about three local examples, and we'll start off having Karen Gaffney share with us about the North Coast Resource Partnership. Thanks, Karen.
Great. Thank you, Louise, and the CLE team and fellow panelists. Very exciting conversation. I'm Karen Gaffney with the North Coast Resource Partnership, and I'm going to talk a bit about collaborative infrastructure that we have built over the last 19 years for sustaining resilient communities and landscapes in the North Coast region of California. And for some reason, my slides are not advancing. Let me just check. That's very odd. There we go. Thanks for your patience. So the North Coast region, as we define it, is a 19,000 square mile region. It's the coastal draining watersheds in Northern California. And our region, as you see in the map here, includes the tribal lands as well as all or part of 7 North Coast counties. It's a source region for the rest of the state and the nation and the world for carbon through forests and water and biological diversity. It's also home to 30 federally recognized tribes. It is profoundly economically challenged with over 50% of the population living under the poverty line, and it has a real diversity of political perspectives within the region. The partnership was convened in 2005, and I'll just kind of give a quick overview of its mission and structure and principles that provide this kind of collaborative backbone infrastructure for the region. The main mission is just enhancing and ensuring thriving communities and landscapes. And we have hundreds, if not thousands, of partners in the region that include tribes, NGOs, counties, cities, et cetera. And we're governed by a leadership council, which is comprised of appointees from the region's tribes, as well as counties, local governments. I like to call it democracy at its finest. We also have a technical committee, also appointed from the region's tribes and counties. And we have a staff team, including myself, our tribal engagement director, and various project and admin team leads. We're held together, all of the partners in the region, hundreds of them, by an MOMU, which is a shared set of principles, goals, and objectives and agreements. And then we also have a policy handbook that guides our day-to-day work and ensures that we're transparent to the public about how we make decisions and how we make investments. There are really strong principles around equity, transparency, inclusion, and developing shared visions. And because, as you see from our region, we're quite diverse in terms of sociopolitics, there's a really strong focus, a foundational principle on common ground and local autonomy, respecting that one size doesn't fit all, but that we're going to focus on the things that unite us rather than divide us. And certainly we have, hundreds of years worth of work to do just on that front. We have a strong emphasis on planning. And using the best available data and science to drive prioritization, and that includes both Western and tribal science and traditional ecological knowledge. To date, we've brought in about $100 million to the North Coast region, which is really meaningful in a disadvantaged region. And our ratio of implementation to planning to implementation is roughly 5 to 95. And then finally, we have a very strong emphasis. Everything we do, we report on a strong emphasis on the effective use of public funding and return on investment. We have multiple objectives and multiple benefits. Some of those do touch on the space that this group is very focused on in terms of energy infrastructure, but many of our objectives are focused on natural capital, and other types of built infrastructure like water, wastewater, communications. We also have a focus on local economic vitality and community health and safety. And we do not implement projects, and it's one of the ways that really helps us to be complementary to our local project sponsors, who are the ones doing the projects on the ground. So our role is really to provide regional collaborative infrastructure in a region that's very decentralized, very rural, and very poor, and also to provide capacity enhancement. We support partners in achieving their outcomes because they're really the knowledgeable ones about what needs to happen in their communities. We develop regional data and local data and assessments and analyses. We convene towards shared vision and shared priorities through workshops and meetings and interviews. We do regional prioritization of projects and activities, working with our state and federal and tribal and local partners. And then we amplify and communicate the need for investments in the North Coast region. We have administered and distributed funding through many large block grants to the region. We also do regional project tracking and performance reporting. We're quite engaged in policy influence. And again, the nature of our decision-making by tribal and county officials, I believe, is nationally unique, kind of recognizing sovereign nations as well as local governments. We have a strong emphasis on synchronizing across these different scales, sovereign nations, tribes, federal government, state government, regional, and local priorities. And that's been a big part of how we've been able to kind of harmonize priorities from a variety of different perspectives and bring the best projects to the ground. One of the outcomes in recent years of this collaborative planning is our vision for North Coast resilience. And I will drop a link to this in the chat. I don't have a lot of time to go through it in detail right now, but it basically is a roadmap for resilience that was developed over multiple years with over 500 partners in the region through workshops, meetings, interviews, polls, et cetera. And out of that has come a shared set of strategies and agreed upon prioritization framework. And we are in the process already of implementing a number of the strategies included here. One of the main focus areas is developing and maintaining year-round local sustainable capacity, so that there is kind of a leadership role of the local communities in implementing projects and initiatives that are important to them. Sorry, the advancing is not working that well. I do apologize. There seems to be a lag. There we go. So we have a particular framework, a formal framework that we use for adaptive planning and prioritization, and that includes integrating regional assessments like spatial analysis and modeling with local knowledge, including Indigenous science to EK and local expertise. And we use that integrated approach to then drive strategic actions and projects, to then prioritize, evaluate, and select those projects and fund them. And also to develop these multi-objective plans that are the kind of blueprint for the region that I shared. Underlying all of this is a really strong focus on technical assistance and capacity building, with the idea that, with so much funding, as Kate just noted, coming out of both the federal and state government, we want to ensure that not only the well-resourced NGOs, tribes, counties, and other organizations have access to that funding, but that all boats rise with the tide. So we have a very significant program that focuses on that capacity development and TA. And then we also then have a strong focus on making sure that what we are planning for and assessing gets implemented. And then we report on the performance of that at the regional scale. And then this kind of cycle then drives the wheel forward and refines our process. And again, all of it underlain by decision-making by our tribal and county representatives. Again, apologize for I don't know why my slideshow is lagging here. Okay, there we go. Just quickly, an example more on the natural infrastructure side of some of the regional analysis of carbon. So this is a way that we document carbon in the 19,000 square mile North Coast region, 12% of California. Most of our carbon is in our forests. And you can see, and you've heard no doubt, of the catastrophic wildfires that have hit our region, huge uptick in fires in the last 20-year period, with profound impacts to human life and economic vitality and ecosystem function, and of course the loss of carbon in those forests that are significant amounts of emissions being released into the atmosphere. Overlaying all of our regional assessments is an ongoing evaluation of our most vulnerable communities. So in the case of fire, but this applies to all the work that we do, looking at communities' exposure and vulnerability to these extreme events and climate change. And so in this particular case, looking at low capacity areas that are inordinately impacted by these catastrophic fires, and then using this information to help prioritize interventions and actions to avoid or make these communities more resilient to those impacts. And so how that looks on the ground is that, we use, high resolution LiDAR, for example, in partnership with NASA and USGS on the left to map out where there are building footprints and where there are roads. And then the black and white colors are fuel loading. So using that at the regional scale to objectively understand what's going on in terms of fire impact or carbon loss, but then having that translate through local knowledge into where should we do prescribed fire, where should we do thinning, where should we plan evacuation routes, and making sure that through every step of that, our Indigenous knowledge is incorporated, as well as our local community knowledge to drive prioritization. So my last slide here, I just want to emphasize that a diverse regional collaboration structure is foundational to regional resilience, and be happy to talk more during the Q&A if there's any questions about our program. Thanks so much.
Great. Thank you so much, Karen. That was terrific. And I know there are already a few questions that have come in, so we will return to those. And now we're going to switch from a more rural context to a large scale to hear from Wilma Franco to talk about the work that they've been doing in Southeast Los Angeles.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And welcome, everybody. Good morning. It's a joy to be here, and thank you for the opportunity. So I'm Dr. Wilma Franco. I'm the Executive Director of the SELA Collaborative. And let me see, I think on my end, make sure. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit, contextualizing, right, like where geographically we are. So we are the Southeast region of LA County. And then so on the right here, you see the map, like these are the cities that we, how we define the Southeast. And then so just for contextual purposes, the Southeast, as defined by other partners, may be a lot larger than this area. And it's something that, like, we often get asked, like, what about this other city? So wanted to make sure, like, this is how we, as a collaborative, define. So our work really goes back as far back as 2010. This is when a lot of those local leaders became just really concerned. I think a lot of it was really as a result of government accountability challenges that the region was experiencing that continued to really kind of, create a little bit of a challenge, right? Because historically, I think the Southeast continues to be talked about from this like deficit and government challenges that we experience, like the city of Bell. And then so this really kind of brought together this local leaders. They had been raised in the Southeast, have been doing work with nonprofit organizations, and really wanted to, how do you bring more resources to the Southeast, right? Acela has been historically not resourced for many, many decades. And this was something that, all these leaders could see. So what happened in that, piece was essentially they couldn't secure funds, right? Because as nonprofit leaders, they think one of their biggest lessons became, we can run our own nonprofit and start a whole new initiative. And then so, fast forward to, 2016, 2017, that's when the collaborative was relaunched with the support of philanthropy and local government leaders like Hilda Solis and Assemblymember Anthony Rendon. And then so that really kind of sparked this kind of like perfect timing opportunity, right? Where there was political will, there was resources from philanthropy, and then there was the leadership, local leadership that really wanted to create this. So as an organization, we are fiscally sponsored, and that means we borrow someone else's, nonprofit status, right? And then so we're actually in transition now. So come, next year, we will become our own nonprofit, which, also impacts how we're able to bring down resources to the region. So one of the things that I know for, our organization and nonprofits in general, right, we always hear about our vision and our missions. One of the things that we put together as a collaborative, right, was this North Star, right, and really thinking about our vision and our mission and what do we want to think and see within the next 10 years. And then so for us, it really came down to, in the next 10 years, right, what we would hope we're able to achieve is that the Acela community will have the power of a cross-sector collective voice that advocates for the region on a county, state, and national level to bring resources and opportunities that essentially improve the quality of life in the Southeast. And then so that's really kind of like our own kind of commitment, right, as a network of let's put a goal out there, right, that really kind of it's time bound and that we're working towards, and then those decisions that we're making, right, and really thinking about strategically how we do the work, always come back to, is this getting us closer to this larger vision that we had for the region? So as I share, we are a collaborative, meaning we have 12 members. These are the 12 founding members of our collaborative. You may know a few of them. Some of them are also just very small organizations in the Southeast. Our fiscal sponsor, who's Human Services Association, is actually one of the largest nonprofits. And one of the things that we realized early on was that the Southeast didn't necessarily have a lot of marketing and communications that really highlighted the work that was happening in the Southeast. So as a collaborative, giving the experience of the partners, trying to launch this initiative, nonprofit capacity building was one of those pieces that became vital to how we do the work, right? What we were hearing from both government and philanthropy was essentially the reason why we don't fund the Acela region is because there's no one to fund. And then so we launched, a nonprofit needs assessment to really try to understand who's in the region. Through that research process, we found that the region actually has 492 nonprofits, of which 250 are churches, right? So as it pertains to civic engagement and how do we empower community and educate community on things like the census or get out the vote, we also recognize, right, that because we do have 250 churches, how do we then create partnerships and strategies with the faith-based community, because they are trusted messengers to our community, right? And then so around data-driven research, everything that we do as an organization goes back to data and research, and really data from the perspective of how do we use this as a learning opportunity? How do we pilot initiatives and then learn through that, right? And then so really trying to support and help our partners and not seeing data from a punitive perspective, which is what I think, historically has happened, right? And then so one of our first research studies and how the collaborative really began to identify opportunities was the Pat Brown Institute and a couple of the members led the asset-based analysis. So we wanted to really look at the region from an asset perspective, like what is there that we need to celebrate, that it's an opportunity for the region versus continuing to talk about the region from a defensive perspective. And then our last piece is really this regional identity. So everything we do, every strategy we think about or we strategize with partners is always about the Southeast as a whole. We wanted to make sure that Cella, right, is known as Cella, because we also know that in LA County, right, there's other areas that like WeHo that we know, well, that's West Hollywood, right? But Cella was an area that a lot of people know about. And even myself, right, I grew up in the South Bay and in LA County, but I didn't necessarily know that like cities like Cudahy existed. And then so we wanted to make sure that people knew where we were and who this community was. One of the things that we do is that we anchor a lot of our conversations and a lot of our strategies on partner feedback. So this is an example of some of the listening tours that we do during the census work right before COVID kind of shut down everything, right? We had been convening the region and leading the census work, and then COVID hit. And then so what we found ourselves was, we had, worked with the California Community Foundation and LA County to have this larger kind of strategy for the census, and we were funding, right? Our partners were funding some of our partners in the Southeast. But what we found was as everything closed, it no longer became a priority, right? Like we knew we needed to ensure for, a complete count of the census, but we also knew that our communities were being impacted by COVID. And then so we really utilized like a listening tour, right? Of, calling all of our partners and asking these specific questions and quantifying the answers, right, to really start informing, okay, how are we going to shift, given that a lot of what we were hearing was community isn't interested in completing a survey when they just lost a job or they just lost a loved one, or they don't know how they're going to feed their children tomorrow. And then so we really needed to be responsive to not only what our partners were doing and hearing and experiencing, but also what our community was suffering at the time. The other piece for us, right, is we continue to really focus on how do we cultivate partnerships. As an organization, we believe that, there's not one organization that's going to be able to address some of these larger issues on their own, or else we would have seen them, right? And then so for us is really how do we model, how do we bring together partners, and how do we work with each other, right? We all have different roles to play, and then so how do we utilize our assets and our resources to really have a larger impact? And that's what we really saw during the census. Just really bringing all these partners together, leveraging resources, building new partnerships, building new relationships that really kind of helped us move the work forward. The other piece for us during this time, right, and even prior to, COVID, has really been about the advocacy. How do we bring the attention of, government and elected leaders, as well as philanthropy, to the needs of our communities here in the Southeast? So one of the things that we were working on prior to COVID was the first of its kind with the California Community Foundation, the Pat Brown Institute, and Latino Decisions, on a survey that we called the Living and Working in Cella survey. And this was really looking at how do we interview and survey community members about what their experience is in their community and in the region, right? For us, I think oftentimes we speak as leaders, right, about these communities without necessarily creating the space for our communities to tell us how they see it. Like they're the ones that live in these communities. They're the ones that, whatever decisions we're making is impacting their day to day. And then so how do we actually capture their feedback, right? And then so, the Pat Brown Institute has been leading in that area in partnership with us. But we were in the midst of completing that survey when COVID happened, right? And then so that also created an opportunity for us to actually launch a second survey, which was really the crisis of COVID. And while we knew that our communities were suffering, right, we couldn't quantify that. And the survey really allowed us to, think about, we know there's a lot of challenges but the minute that we saw, one of the questions that really stayed with me was, we asked community, how much money or how much resources do you have for a rainy day, right? Like if you lose your job or something happens, how much, in savings do you have? And the majority of our community said $300 to $600. And that, when you think about the extent and the length of COVID and how that impacted the communities, like our communities were suffering, the first month of the pandemic, shutting down everything, right? And then so it really kind of was what brought us together as a region, right, again, to work on what we called and really what our priority is for the next couple of years, the SELA agenda. And then so this was a report that we put together, the first of its kind for the region, in partnership with 80 leaders, that calls on investment opportunities for the Southeast. And then so this we launched on March 3rd of 2021. Some of the major themes that came and informed the agenda from our conversations with the network and the leaders was essentially, really focusing on nonprofit strength. We all saw, right, how nonprofits continue to be the safety net in our communities. And then so how do we continue to support them, right, so that they can have what they need and our resource so that they can help community. There was a high focus, right, on deep civic engagement. How do we empower community to participate, right, and really kind of lead this efforts? There's the intersectionality lens, right, of in SELA, and I think a lot of us right now recognize that we can't talk about issues of health and climate without talking about the environment and all these other pieces, right? So how these issues are all really interconnected, and we need to look at solutions and strategies moving forward from that space. The other piece was accountability, not only accountability for, our elected leaders and government, but also for ourselves as leaders of if we have set out to do specific things, how do we all hold each other accountable, which oftentimes can be difficult. And then I think for the Southeast, right, is really emphasizing the need for us to follow local leadership. There's a lot of leaders doing work in the Southeast. They just haven't necessarily been acknowledged, nor because we haven't received the resources, right, have been able to do more of what they have been doing for many years. The agenda really created an opportunity for us to actually lead on the COVID vaccine. So we were tapped by the president's office and the governor's office. We were asked if we would take the lead on COVID vaccine, specifically in the Southeast, which, I always tell folks, my team is a team of 4. There's only 4 of us. And then so receiving this call, we knew, because it was the biggest focus and priority in our agenda, that we needed to ensure that there was equity in the distribution of vaccines and that our communities were not, left out the way they were left out of testing. This was a no-brainer to us, right? But I think for us, it was also, how do we leverage the partners, right? How do we leverage the network that we have been building to really make sure that we're reaching community and supporting in the implementation of this piece. So I know I mentioned the SELA Leaders Network. This is something that, we have been working for the last 4 years, since, I came in 2018. In 2019, we began convening the local leadership, and we use this tool called Kumu Mapping. It's a network mapping tool. And then so we wanted to really kind of show folks how we're all kind of interconnected, right? So one of the things that we asked was, representing not only who was in the space, but also policy area, right? Like a lot of us are doing work, and we had shared with the group, like, a lot of the participants said environmental justice is a priority of theirs. But then when we asked what specifically within environmental justice, there were folks that said water or trees or all these other pieces, right? That we said, now, how do we start planting the seed of like, what would happen if all of us that say environmental justice is a priority to us actually work together to address the issues? Because we're all not necessarily specifically focusing on the same area, right? And then so this was in 2019. This was our most recent map in 2022, last year. We are now currently convening close to 300 leaders in the Southeast, and this includes nonprofit leaders, elected officials, community members, city staff, that have come together to be part of this network, where we're really kind of pushing forward the conversations around partnerships and collaborations and the implementation of the agenda. A lot of our work, right, is like I said, is focused on data. Like, how do we use data to really drive the strategies? But it's very relational, and I think that's one of the things that when it comes to collaborative work, it's about the relationships that we build with each other. A lot of the strategies that we have been able to implement comes from the conversations that we have, right? Whether it's quantitative data or qualitative data. So we build, strategies like nonprofit capacity building that included things like trainings, workshops, coaching, so that the nonprofit leaders have the support that they need in advancing their work. The regional advocacy efforts, right? Continuing to really talk about the Southeast and uplifting what the Southeast is experiencing. The other piece, and I think this piece, something that we implemented early on was this regional marketing strategy. So we realized through our needs assessment early on that there were so many nonprofits and doing so much work, but no one knew about it. And then so we really began to use our marketing resources to become like this regional, okay, well, let me share your work and let me share your work. Early on, I remember folks said, in exchange for what? Like, what do you need from us? And we often said, well, nothing, because if we can share about the resources and the services you're providing to community, then all of our community wins, right? And then so really kind of modeling that, and we continue to play that role in the Southeast and continue to launch campaigns to really uplift the work of our partners in the region. And then everything that we do is centered on community driven and community informed. So we do engage community a lot, whether it's through research, through our Sala Leaders Network, through every conversation, because we feel that at the center of real change comes from the community voice, right? Is at the end of the day, it's their lives. And I often share, I think as leaders, we are context experts, but they are the content experts, and they really understand their lives, and we need to make sure that we're including them through this process. So other ways that we're really kind of advancing the agenda, and this is what our colleagues shared, we did secure the Regional Climate Collaborative funding in partnership with the Gateway COG. So the Gateway COG in Sela is actually part of our Sela Leaders Network, right? And then so they reached out and said, hey, listen, there's this opportunity. It aligns with the Sela agenda. It's a lot of what you've already put in there with your partners. Could we, partner on this? And then so we did submit it. I will be very honest in saying I really thought we weren't going to get it. And so I remember talking with our colleagues and saying, well, let's go for the full amount. Just kind of worried that maybe we wouldn't, but maybe we will, right? And then so we did secure the 1.75 million, which was the highest amount. And then so we're continuing to do that work. We really currently in the structural governance conversations. We're also leading on the Lower LA River as the community engagement lead for the Southeast. We're doing some research with the USC on EV adoption and its impact on asthma, specifically in communities like ours, and then launching our final Sela Region campaign, which is really a marketing strategy to bring more attention to the work that's happening, but also to the leadership that exists in the Southeast. So a lot of it for us lands in this space of capacity building, but also the regional advocacy that we continue to do for the Southeast. And I'll leave you with this. I think this is the one thing that we always share with our partners, right? That our goal is really to create systemic change through this collective impact, place-based approach. But we understand that in order for us to really do this, we need to have strong neighborhood organizations and have mutual support networks. So that's really where our work really focuses in. We're not a service provider, right? We don't want to enter that space because that's the space of our partners. And then so we are really the Southeast regional convener and connector as we continue to do the work. And the African proverb we always share with the partners is if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, we have to go together. So I'll leave you with that. And thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Wilma. That was terrific. And I think we're already seeing some similar themes across some of the discussion. So now we'll go to our final speaker, Anne Rogan, who will share with us about some of the terrific work she's been doing in Stockton. Thanks, Anne.
Thanks, Luis, and thanks, everyone. I'll spend a little bit of time talking today about our team's work in Stockton and the Northern Central Valley. But I also will talk a little bit today about civic infrastructure and why we believe that's a really important precursor to community benefits, and particularly recognizing the moment we're in around climate, around community, around place. So for some context before I get into it, Anne Brogan, I'm the founder and CEO of Edge Collaborative. We're a civic incubator that is based in Stockton, about an hour and 20 minutes east of the Bay Area, about 45 minutes south of Sacramento. And we grew out of a recognition from my time working in local government, advising a former mayor of the city of Stockton, just how much need there was in a place in the Central Valley that has historically been faced with challenges around environmental justice, around a lack of capacity to engage meaningfully with municipal agencies, and sort of the perceptions of economic development and what that actually meant for the region broadly. So I'll kind of center us around this idea that historically in places like Stockton, because we are certainly not alone in this, that for the longest time, environmental justice and economic development have sat on completely opposite ends of the spectrum. And there's been very little overlap. And if there has been overlap, it's been fairly unproductive overlap. By that, I mean, the things that environmental justice groups have cared about have historically been not things that the traditional economic development communities and stakeholders have cared about. And so a lot of the work that animates the way in which we do our work at Edge Collaborative is bringing some cases opposing forces and groups that have normally not sat together to sit together and to find in very uncomfortable, usually very controversial spaces, points of intersection. And I think that is particularly critical now, given how much public investment is coming down from the state and federal government, and is sort of unlocking the imagination of what can be done in local communities. So I say all of that because I want to reflect on something that Kate shared at the beginning of her comments, and that emissions reductions do not actually equal addressing growing inequality. There are two things that we've noticed in this work. My work in local government, I think coming out of local government, is that there's really two principles and two principles that animate our work here, and that is inequality and climate. Because they are challenges, but because we also see them as massive opportunities. And for many of us, we have wanted to work in these spaces, but have not, frankly, had the ability, or there's not been, I think, an ecosystem in which to pursue that level of work. So to talk a little bit about civic infrastructure and what that actually means in practice, there's a few things that I want to point to. One, in many sort of what I would think of Stockton as an emerging market. I think there's a lot of emerging markets across California, and there's a lot of missing institutional infrastructure in these communities and cities across the state. What I mean by that is in places that are more well-resourced and have a little bit more sophisticated of an ecosystem, you have things like community development corporations. You have things like community land trusts and community development finance institutions. And the presence of those institutions actually allows communities to organize in different ways. And it actually allows, and in some cases unlocks, the ability to bring capital into these places that have not actually had access to different forms of capital. I'm talking about loans, but I'm also talking about grants. And I'm talking about the ability to move resources in different ways that focuses on capacity building for communities that have been left behind, but it also gives access to different types of capital that builds on capacity building, that starts to seed and think about projects that can be generated by communities themselves. So that's kind of the first piece of civic infrastructure that we look at here in our work. The second thing that we do in our work is we try and shape markets with a community lens. Shaping markets is tricky business for a lot of reasons, but I think because communities historically have not had access to information and to research that is shaping the way that state and federal incentives are moving the market, whether that's direct air capture, whether that's carbon capture and storage. There's a whole universe of climate technologies that are being deployed where communities just have not had access and frankly have not had time and bandwidth to engage in a really meaningful way. And so shaping the market looks at how do we actually bring more research to bear? How do we actually give communities the chance to hire staff to get smart on these new technologies so that they can actually provide public comment in a way that makes sense and in a way that can actually shape the regulatory environment and shape the rules that are being created right now for billions of dollars in investments that are coming into the state, into other places across the country. And then the third piece around civic infrastructure that I want to point to, and then I'm going to get a little bit into Stockton and the work itself, is where are the community-led projects? We know that initiatives like Justice 40 are designed to drive investments into disadvantaged communities, particularly those communities that have struggled with environmental justice challenges historically. But we also know that in a lot of these places, there's been a dearth of community-driven projects. And so a lot of the work that animates the way in which we support community in Stockton is centered on how do we actually put community at the center of creating projects. And so that is long-term work, is sort of what we refer to as long-term temporary incubation work. But it's really about seeding not just capacity building, but helping to support the generation of ideas that can actually turn into projects that communities actually run themselves. So I'll set that as this kind of a civic infrastructure foundation. We can kind of dive into that later if it's helpful, but I'll kind of set context on Stockton and talk a little bit about the ways in which we've engaged with the state on community benefits. So Stockton, as I mentioned, is in the Central Valley. We've historically suffered from some of the worst air quality in the state, with disproportionately high rates of asthma. The context around that is we're inland California. We are surrounded by agriculture. We actually have access to a deep water inland port, and we have Highway 5, 99, and 4 that sort of bisect the city in different ways. What that's meant is disproportionate impacts on air quality on communities of color that have suffered because they have been in the crosshairs of freeways getting constructed. And for communities that have lived near the port, there's been many challenges historically relative to the disproportionate environmental pollution that they suffer. They are proximate to trucks that are coming in and out of the port, and the pollution that results from that. So there is a context in Stockton that is not dissimilar from many places across the state, where there are challenges of trying to tackle the past and tackle sort of the bread and butter EJ challenges, while also trying to envision a different way of doing things and a different future, knowing that there's a climate infrastructure opportunity that we have access to right now. The other thing I'll point to is a sort of historical context is that in 2008, the Sierra Club sued the city of Stockton for their general plan and the sprawl in which they considered to be sort of worsening environmental outcomes. Over the course of several years, that led to the creation of a climate action plan in 2014, adopted by the city of Stockton. And that sort of, I think, from an outsider's perspective, is a really important context setting to look at what then transpired over the following decade. What Luis mentioned at the beginning in terms of state level initiatives, you have TCC, which is the Transformative Climate Communities. She mentioned regional climate collaboratives, and she mentioned SURF, which is the Community Economic Resilience Fund. All of these projects and initiatives have taken root in Stockton at various points in its sort of climate journey. The TCC initiative, this is around 2017, 2018, was really quite critical in this idea of governance. And how do you actually bring community and government together in a way that is productive and in a way that actually yields results? I was working in local government at the time and can attest that it was a very messy process, as governance conversations tend to be. But I think what it did was it actually unlocked a foundation of how to think about community owning governance. By owning governance, I mean seeing themselves as having a seat at the table and having the wherewithal to actually set the terms and parameters for what governance should look like on other projects. So from our vantage point, TCC was sort of a keystone initiative from the state, but I think really transformative for its impact in Stockton in terms of what it actually enabled and unlocked on other climate investments. Following that, AB 617, which stands for Assembly Bill 617, brought in about $32 million worth of investment on air quality. Again, a community-led, community-governed process. in partnership with local air quality districts. And then we get into sort of more recent history around SURF. And SURF, I think, is sort of an interesting trial and experiment from the state around how do you actually bring counties together with a shared sense of regional identity that has not historically existed, and how do you actually weave community input into that process. I think the jury's still out on what that will look like over time, but I think from the Stockton perspective, there has been a learning journey of how to engage productively with groups that have normally not sat together at the table, and trying to figure out what is shared governance, what is shared power structures actually, what do they actually look like. And then I'll talk a little bit about sort of how that's manifested in terms of specific projects. There's two that I'll point to in a Stockton context. There's many more to share with sort of we can get into in the Q&A if that's useful. One of them is that I mentioned at the outset that community benefits, I think, has been thought of historically as in a traditional context of there's a project, that project has a developer, and the community is responding to that project and to that project developer. There is a lot of room, I think, for community to have agency and to sort of say, hey, here's what we actually need, here's what we want to make sure that this makes sense and actually benefits us beyond jobs, beyond workforce training. There's also a world in which community benefits can actually look like community setting the terms for the entire project themselves and finding mission-aligned and values-aligned partners in their own community and helping to drive that strategy from the very outset. And one of the examples of that in Stockton has been a 5-year project that we have helped to incubate and support with public housing and community to put electric vehicles at every single public housing site in the county. The origins of that story were much more humble. It began with a 2-car vision and no public money, and a public agency that did not necessarily know what an electric vehicle was. But over time, that project has grown and not just been deployed, but is now creating local jobs and is now actually being resourced from the state to provide workforce training for folks in public housing that want to work in those jobs, and for folks in public housing to actually benefit from the use of that infrastructure. So I think there's a really interesting sort of way to think about community benefits and sort of who's driving the community benefit, who's owning that project, and who's actually shaping it over time. The second example I'll give is a very different example, and one that is much more emergent, fast moving, and frankly, much more complex. And that is around carbon removal. And this idea and this recognition that the Central Valley has some interesting geology that has become interesting to industry. And as our geology in the Central Valley has become interesting to industry, there's been an emergent set of conversations around carbon capture, utilization, and storage. I say all of this to say that EDGE Collaborative got involved in the carbon removal conversation nearly 3 years ago and brought in, after hearing from EJ groups, brought in a national lab in our backyard, about 20 minutes away, Lawrence Livermore National Lab, to assist in educating community about what actually carbon removal was. And that set the foundation for how community could sort of shape the market for what carbon removal could look like in a place like Stockton. And that has had a lot of twists and turns in that journey. But I think ultimately what it's done is it's helped groups on both sides. It's helped industry, and I think it's helped community try and understand where each is coming from. And there's still a lot of disagreement, as I think I'm not surprised that there is, and I'm actually quite happy that there's a lot of disagreement on the issue. But I think what it's doing is that it's opening up a more nuanced and complex conversation around what should community benefits look like with a technology that is moving very quickly, and that a lot of community groups historically have not been aware of or had access to research on. And so really, I think community benefits can look very different in many different places and with a lot of different technologies and projects. But what we're seeing in a place like Stockton is that we have to invest in the civic infrastructure necessary to have that degree of nuance and complexity to make sure that community is not just getting direct support, is not just pushing for local jobs, but can actually talk about what should revenue share look like? What should actually investing in community beyond jobs look like? Because if they have a chance of actually setting those terms, then I think there's really an opportunity to think about governance in a very different way than many of these places have done in the past. And so really, I think I would challenge all of us in our various communities to think about how do we push the boundaries of investing in civic infrastructure, and how do we challenge ourselves to think about what community benefits can look like beyond what we know to be true that has been done in the past. So with that, Louise, I will pass it back to you.
Great. Thank you all so much. That was really terrific. Really great to hear different perspectives. So I think we're now going to have time we have about just over half an hour left to have some questions. So encourage folks to put questions. I know we already have a few in the Q&A. And so while folks think through things they may want to put in there, I think I might just start with a question. Maybe I'll start with Kate and then kind of go to everyone else, which is sort of part of the reason we're having this conversation here is that there's been, and we're in California, these projects are in California, and there's been a lot of work that has happened here in the state. I know it's happening in other places too, but I'm just curious if you could speak to how you've seen the discussion at the federal level being informed by some of the state and local efforts that have been happening.
Yeah, I think very clearly there's influence throughout, and I'll just point to a couple of things. The whole idea of sort of embedding both sort of a data-driven approach around sort of asset mapping and looking at the actual opportunities and risks in the community, and in meaningful community engagement. A lot of that actually does come from Strategic Growth Council work in the research program, as well as in the programs you talked about. I should say that I didn't talk about it that much, but the Community Benefits Plan approach at Department of Energy also applies to the research, the R&D grants, and a lot of that came out of the research program approaches from Strategic Growth Council. You also see a direct connection between the existence of Justice 40 and the CalEnviroScreen approach in California, and this idea that 1% of the benefits should accrue to, what in the federal language is disadvantaged communities. I know that's a controversial term. I did want to say, based on something Anne said, one of the challenging things about Justice 40 that's different from the California version. In California, it's legislated that a certain percent of the cap and trade funds go to lower resource communities. Justice 40 is not in legislation. It was created by executive order, has not been incorporated into legislation, and it does not actually require that 40% of the funding goes to those communities. It requires that 40% of the benefits go to those communities. And that's been a big source of confusion and conversation and a difference from the California version. But I think there's a lot, Louise, of connections. And California has certainly been a place where people have watched this play out. Some of the first community benefits agreements in the country were in California. The Staples Center is the famous one. So I do think that where California has not been the leader, other states have for various reasons, is on things like some of the more industrial projects, mining projects. The agreements around those, we've actually seen really significant progress in Canada in particular, because most of those are on tribal lands, or First Nations lands. And then also, to some extent, in the northern U.S., North Dakota, Minnesota, has seen some really interesting stuff in that space. So I think that's something California is going to have to start looking at, particularly as we're looking at both things like Lithium Valley, which is a significant mining project, but also, to Anne's point, things around carbon removal, which have significant geologic implications.
Great. And I wonder, Wilma, Karen, Anne, what would you most like to see reflected or prioritized in some of the federal approaches that around guidance around community benefits from your experience? What do you think are some of the most important factors?
Yes, I think I know Kate, you mentioned Strategic Growth Council, the research. So we were part of the research with USC, and then so I know that initially I think we were the first and the only CBO partner that was being compensated for that work. And then so I think definitely seeing more of that piece where I think oftentimes, right, nonprofits are reached out to because we have access to community, but they're not being compensated, or at least there's like caps, right? One of the things that we're working on with a number of partners here in LA County is around an equity reform on the equity and county contracting, and I know a lot of the conversation then always lands in, well, the county has specific regulations because the state puts those regulations, and then we talk to the state and the state says, well, that's coming down from federal, right? So there's all these rules that limits really looking at CBO partners, right, and community partners, and compensating them. And I know, my previous associate director used to always reference, Cynthia Cortez around, in the business world, businesses pay so much money into like really getting feedback on their products and really kind of testing these pieces out, right? And what we ask of our community is the same, right? We want to know your feedback, we want to know how this may impact you, but we're not willing to compensate. So I think it's really making sure that there is that piece, right, of compensation, not only to the nonprofit people that are doing the work and that we want to partner with, but also thinking about how do we compensate our community members. So that's something that I know with Jen Giuliano at USC, we have always kind of included, right, in us being a community, outreach partner in that research. Even things like, a $50 gift card, like gas gift card, right, to the community members, or food, because we're asking them for their time and we're not providing that. Oftentimes as a single mom, right, like I'm not going to attend an event in the evening if I don't have childcare. And then so to ask of community to be involved without there being any consideration or even the ability for us as partners to compensate and to really be mindful of those pieces, I think limits the ability to really have meaningful community engagement.
I can chime in as well. I would emphasize everything that Wilma just shared relative to compensation, is both a fundamental issue and often missing issue. And I think even recognizing that some communities are doing research and asking research questions that need to be compensated by state and federal agencies. So I think it's certainly about time, but it's also in some of these communities are very sophisticated in terms of their abilities to ask questions and to put priorities on the radar of state actors and federal actors that should be benefiting from their lived experience. But the other thing I'll point to.
Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry, Ann. Go ahead.
Oh, Kate, go ahead and respond if you want.
No, just really quickly, just because you both made a similar point, I wanted to say one of my biggest frustrations when I was at the federal level is, and I think it's a real challenge, is that the agencies with the most money on this in this process, so that's really energy, transportation, defense, honestly, with the most money going out the door to projects, also don't get any appropriations to do any of the community engagement. The agencies that get those appropriations tend to be Commerce and EPA, which are much smaller and have less money going out the door. And so one of the big frustrations is how can you do what you're both asking for, which is critically important. I think some of that actually will require congressional pushing and more flexibility around blending and braiding funds, constant challenge, but also some of it might have to be pushing the philanthropic community to actually do better at long-term sustained support for communities, which I also think is just something we've got to address in this space. So just thinking about like, where does that money come from and who's invested and how do we do that, I think is a really, really important question.
I have a spicy answer, but I'll pause for now.
Okay.
We'll come back and do it later.
I wanted to really amplify what Dr. Franco said, and then what Kate, what you were just saying is exactly where I think we want to see focus, which is how do we get federal and state agencies to start really looking at strategic long-term capacity investments rather than what sometimes, because it's volatile in nature, acts as number one, a barrier to entry for economically challenged or under-resourced communities. But even when grant funding is received, it takes a toll, especially if it's a 2 to 3 year grant. So you see this volatility of up and down funding and kind of a crash and burn cycle, which is not good for long-term capacity. And then I think just, there are mechanisms strategically to come up with, rather than random acts of investment, and state and federal agencies making decisions about what they think is the best idea based on, who they're talking to in a particular community, and instead having a performance-based strategy so that, we hold communities to very high standards of performance and ask them to demonstrate that they can deliver. I think that's better in the long term for them. It certainly raised our bar. We had to kind of meet a higher standard, and it made us a better coalition. And I think it has enhanced capacity in these local communities, but it's got to be long term and it's got to be more stable.
Great, thanks. I think one thing that came through that we've also talked quite a bit about in the offshore wind context overall, as we've been talking about CBAs, but I think is not unique, is the time horizon on all of this work. So it was clear from each of your presentations that this is not just something that popped up to an opportunity, but there was a lot of work that led up to building the coalition and doing the work. So that is, something we've been talking quite a bit about in that context. But for all of these projects, the money is coming now, and it might be quite a long time before something is implemented, but doing the work in the lead up to that to build the coalition and the partnership is so important. I want to be able, we are getting a number of questions in, so I'm going to try to combine a few of them. One I wanted that I know we had all talked about as well was a little bit around coalition building and sort of what that has looked like. There was a question in the chat specifically, Karen, for you. So maybe we could, and I actually don't know that this is quite the same as coalition building, but there was a question if you could explain a bit more about what it meant to synchronize across tribes and local governments, and sort of how you've done that in the North Coast work.
Yeah, thank you. And I saw that question from Heather at the Coastal Commission, and I think it's related to the question from Theo. So maybe I'll kind of try to address both of them at the same time.
Great.
Tribes and local governments, obviously very different iterations of governance. But this may sound really simplistic, but we just spend the time. So we're a very large decentralized region. We're sensitive about emissions, whether this is about outreach or whether it's about alignment with tribes and local governments. So, we certainly utilize technology very, to a high level, whether it's Zoom, phone calls, polling, et cetera, SurveyMonkey. But there's no substitute for getting together in person. And we do a fair amount of that. We have quarterly meetings with our leadership council, which is both tribal and county, and they hash things out. Most of their decisions are unanimous. So staff are both tribal and local government, and other staff. We have a technical committee, which is both tribal and local government. And then all of our convenings have, many of them are held at tribal venues or county venues, and we always have significant number of participants from both tribes and counties. So there's just this inherent conversational trust building work that's taking place. But in addition to that, we use a mechanism for developing plans where we move very slowly, and I think this gets at Dr. Franco's point, through a process where we go from an outline to an annotated outline to a draft to a final. We don't say, hey, here's a draft, you have 30 days to comment. And if you didn't comment, then it means you don't care and you don't get to be represented, and we'll put your comments in the back in an appendix. So there really is this kind of taking the time to have meaningful engagement across the spectrum. And also there's a very strong intention around an integrated approach to tribal and county leadership. And I think, several people have noted respecting engagement based on what people's resources are and where they are. So really, I've heard from a lot of our tribal partners. I certainly don't speak for the tribes, but I've heard from a lot of them, like this whole Western idea of speed. And I think Dr. Franco said moving at the speed of trust is much more appropriate. That is I think has been a real lesson for a lot of our local government leaders, to make sure to take the time to have the conversations and build that trust, rather than use the typical kind of Western approach to plan development.
Great. And maybe I'll tack on to that also, just 'cause there's a related question here that was actually specific then to the work of SELA, which was how you structured your listening tours. And so that seems like it actually ties nicely into what Karen was just speaking about.
Yeah, so a lot of it, so we have the network, right? So we have like our SELA Leaders Network. And then so we engage them once every quarter. And then so a lot of it is, one, updating them on our work, but also hearing from them on like what are the projects that they're working on, what are maybe some of the needs. Because we're leading on a number of initiatives, right? Engaging them through those spaces is also helpful. But I think the example that I provided on the census was specifically to the census, right? So I think given that, we had already shut down, my staff just, we just picked up the phone and called. So we have been very fortunate to have a team that's very data driven. And then so we specifically focus on just those 3 questions and ask like, what do you need? What are some challenges? What are some opportunities? Like, and then really kind of capture that and then share that back. Like, and I think that's one of our strategies that we consistently have. I saw a question around like, how do you meaningfully engage community, right? And our model is really, we engage community first before we start a lot of our projects to really kind of get a sense of like what their concerns are. The one thing that we're always advocating for is going back to the same community and saying, hey, this is what we heard from you. Is this correct? Is there anything else you want to add? Because what we have consistently heard, right, from community members is we get asked all the time, right? Can you complete the survey? Can you give me your feedback? But you never know where that leads. Like you never hear back from those people. And then so one of the things that we have continuously done, right, is continue to go back and say, here's what's going to happen if it leads to an agenda or if it leads to action, then communicating that so that they know like, hey, it was important for you to be part of that process, right? And this is what it led to. Because I think going back to the, what Karen was saying, like it feels trust, and it also feels that like, oh, like you actually do care, right? Like you're consistently engaging us. And then so that's how we kind of approach our work.
Great. Another question I think it would be great to hear from you all, and maybe Anne, I'll start with you on this one, which is what examples of civic structural changes can you give that support community level governance? I would welcome everyone's thoughts on this, but Anne, maybe starting with you.
Easy question.
Yeah.
I think ultimately it comes down to how are we sharing power with one another? And municipalities are not used to that language. I don't think they've ever, maybe with the exception of being on a city council and sort of sharing power with your other council members, there's not really, I think, a familiarity or a comfort with this idea of collaborative stakeholder structures, in particular with community. One of the things that I think TCC did a very good job at was walking through and putting that in the criteria and the guidelines. Similar to what Kate mentioned for how DOE thought about community benefits. I think this comes down to templates for governance. Like what literally are the 5 or 10 different ways to think about creatively structuring collaborative stakeholder structures. And I would love, this kind of feeds back into this question of like, what would I love to see filter up to the federal guidance? I'd actually love to see the state and or the federal government put out a template of like, here are 10 different ways to think about collaborative stakeholder structures and governance more broadly. Because if we're asking community to either respond to project development, or we're asking them to create their projects in partnership with municipal agencies, it's hard to do that, where there's a very unclear starting point for that work. And I think if we don't, I think Karen made the point very eloquently about how to think about collaborations across tribes and local government and community more broadly. That's really difficult work to do. And there's a lot of cultural competency embedded into that. And there's a lot of cultural competency and bureaucracy of working with municipalities in the first place. So I would just, when I think about civic structural needs, I think about level setting, like everyone's speaking a different language. And how do we sort of detangle language fluency, like what's the language that a mid-level staffer at the county speaks, and what's the language that community speaks, and what's the language that the private sector speaks. And then that's a whole 12-month enterprise by itself, to say nothing then of like, what are the 10 different ways to think about governance and shared governance. So I think I think that is a very helpful research project that someone should be taking up and embedding into state and federal guidance.
Can I add something, Elise?
Please. Yeah.
I think, and your comments made me just think about something that I'm consistently thinking about, right? And you're right, it's about the definition, right? Like the way that we define terms, the way that we kind of see different things, right? And I think that's something that I have consistently seen in this work, right? I think oftentimes folks confuse collaboration with coordination. They're two very different things, right? And then so, the example that I can give is like, you help me coordinate by moving this table, right? Where, you are helping me collaborate, and we're collaborating. It means a lot more, right? There's accountability pieces that come into this. There's data pieces. I think one of the things that we continuously see in this work is that oftentimes, right, there is the well-meaning like policy aspect of it, but it's in the implementation that everyone defines that very different, right? And then so implementation is where I think, as someone that has, did her master's in public policy, like was it irks me, right? Just because I feel like policy is great, but then it's when you're implementing that everything falls apart. And if you don't engage the right people, if you don't know how to kind of level set and share power, then things aren't going to move the way you intended things to move. And then so I think that has been, and I think this type of work really is one of those biggest lessons in like communication. Like, how do we, even in having those conversations and defining the work, right? It's like, well, what do you mean? What does that mean for you? What does that look like for you? Versus assuming that we're all speaking the same language and understanding the same concepts the same way. Because I think our lived experiences is what makes it be different, right? And acknowledging that and being able to kind of say like, okay, well, your business, I'm nonprofit, what you're saying sounds like this to me. Can you tell me what that looks like for you, right? And really kind of understanding context before we start moving.
And I don't know, Karen, is there anything you want to add on sort of, you've spoken quite a bit about your structure, but is there anything you want to add here?
We're, first of all, I really just love listening to these other, my colleagues here on the panel, just remarkable and wonderful. We're part of ARCA, the Alliance for Climate Change Collaboratives, and I always say the name exactly wrong, so apologies there. But and we're also part of other statewide coalitions related to integrated water management, et cetera. And we always learn so much from them. And I just want to really amplify the one size does not fit all. I've seen some incredibly successful collaborations at the scale of a small watershed. We're one of the larger ones. I love what we do and I love how we're structured, but I certainly wouldn't advocate that it's the only standard. I really like what Anne is saying, though, about having guidance on the actual structure, because most programs just have guidance on, the content or the objective to be achieved. And the structure is just so foundationally important. And the other thing is, I feel like we have to be very thoughtful about wasting people's precious time, and also making sure that if we're going to engage with them and ask them to share, take the time out of their busy days, especially people who are in under-resourced areas, then we better do something productive with it, and it better be sustainable over the long term. It's really a bit of a dagger in the heart when people put a lot of time and energy into providing their amazing brain trust thinking about what should happen in their community, and then 2 years later they see a program just crash down and stop.
Great. And building on that, there's actually questions in here that I think is related. And I think, Wilma, this also speaks to you talking about going back to the community. So if you asked, you can go back and say, this is what we heard, this is what's happened. Do you all, like, how do you tackle engagement fatigue, or the fact that there are folks you have to keep going back to, or, and I think there's a number of elements, as we touched on, also compensation, how you design and structure your engagement, but are there other things that you want to speak to around sort of experience with sort of the fatigue that community organizations may feel.
Yeah, so I think on our end, like the example that comes to mind is like our focus groups when we do research. So we do a lot of focus groups. But when we do those focus groups, right, we always offer like childcare services, translation, dinner, and then we then give a $50 gift card, whether it's like Target or like a Vons or something like food related or gas, right? And then so we give them the option. And then so I think what we have seen is oftentimes our community is very appreciative of that, right? And they want to be engaged. They want to see, they want to have a say in what's happening in their communities. I think it's just oftentimes like one timing, because we have a lot of community members that are also very active, right? And I think the more we do the work, the more people get engaged, which is great. But we also have to be very strategic, like, because we do represent 8 cities, right? There's a lot of council meetings, or there's a lot of commission meetings, or all these other things. So we have to specifically, we only hold events on Thursdays or Fridays, because those are the only times that we can engage. The other times, like there's so much going on with, local government or community events that we have to be very strategic. And because we do have that regional marketing strategy, right? Like we often know what all the other partners are doing. So we try to strategize, not competing, when we know other community members trying to engage in those areas as well. So it's a little challenging, but I think when you come from that space of like, hey, we're compensating you for your time, I think community is much more receptive to give their thoughts and really spend that time with you.
Great. I'm going to move to another question so we can try to get through a few more, because there's some really some good ones in here that I would love. Kate, this one is actually very specifically to you, but it speaks to the transparency and accountability question, which is if you could speak more to sort of go, no-go review processes for DOE. And we at CLE are working on one of the grants for the direct air capture work. And I know there are these go, no-go decision points. I think they're now calling them something slightly different, if I recall. But how do you see that with the community benefits plan requirement, and sort of if an awardee fails to meet a milestone, how do you think how will DOE work with the awardee, and how has that been considered?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think, frankly, it's an evolving answer. So the community benefits plans were created again, in a universe where we at DOE were trying to figure out how to do the best possible job pushing private sector applicants to consider community benefits, because that's the leverage point, right? That's where DOE has leverage. Most of the money Congress gives the department doesn't allow for grants to communities. So like the money is going to the private sector to do a project, and the DOE sort of classic way to do that would have been get the technical experts together to figure out the best technology at the best price point, and then just give money. And this is a really new approach. So a lot of things had to happen, I'll just say, to do that. One was a big diversification of the review process, because the review process was set up for technical reviewers. So we actually had to put a massive amount of work into just getting new reviewers into the system. The review process now actually includes 2 separate processes. The review of the community benefits plan is separate from the review of the technical plan. And then they go up into a portfolio review where there are these super reviewers that review across the board. Sort of interesting. So like they're separate and then they're together at the next stage. And some of you actually listening or even here might have been tapped as super reviewers, because you need to have like this very integrated approach to projects to be a super reviewer. If you want to be one, let me know, because they need them. The second thing, to your point, is, then like the super review happens, the initial decision gets made to enter negotiation. So the initial decision is not a decision to fund, it's a decision to enter a negotiation with the applicant. And that's where the commitments made of the community benefits plans get into the contract. That's a negotiated process. Where they are spelled out by budget period, and they're in there. And the ones that are real commitments, like if you commit to doing a project labor agreement, that's in there. If you commit to a number of meetings or a community engagement specialist or creating a community review panel, that goes in there. So I think that's all great and really important. But then the question becomes your question of like, okay, what if somebody doesn't do the thing? And that's a really hard question, because like that's true on the technical side too. What if the innovative thing you're doing to replace lithium and lithium batteries and go to something else, because we don't want to be so dependent on lithium. What if that thing doesn't work? At what point do you not get funded anymore? At what point, if you committed to a piece of the community benefit plan, is it actually stop funding, or does it just trigger a new negotiation? I don't think we know, because it's such a new process. I will say, just because now I don't work for the government anymore, so I can say something slightly political, this is why administrative staff at the federal level matters so much. The people making these decisions are civil servants. And this is why we care that there is a civil servant full of people who actually know what they're doing, because this is who's making these decisions. If you decimate the civil service, whether it's at the IRS or at these agencies, nobody's doing this anymore. And so I think that's really important. I wish I had a better answer for you. I do think this is an area where there needs to be a lot of public input to the department. So highly recommend that people actually raise this issue, and push the department to figure it out, because you need that kind of external pressure on this kind of issue. So sorry for the long answer, but I think it's useful. Also, the slide that for some reason didn't show up when I went through my slides is a little bit about this process, and I'll share the slides, so it'll be there.
Great, thanks. Well, we have another question that I may use as a way to kind of ask everyone to respond, because I think it's a broad question, but I think is one that could be really helpful to hear everyone's thoughts on, that maybe in the last 7 minutes we could go through, which is advice to communities that are dealing with, in this case, the questions around industrial parks or distribution center coming to the Central Valley, and they're asking them to enter into community benefits agreements, and how what advice you would give. And I think I would broaden this a little bit to say, there's a lot of projects that are coming right now around the state of California. So we've touched today on, there's renewable energy, there's hydrogen, there's direct air capture, a lot in the Central Valley in particular. And so would love, just broadly hear from each of you, your perspectives and advice you would give to communities as they approach entering into community benefits agreements with one or many of those projects, as they come along. I don't know who would want to start. Or I can pick someone.
I can start.
Okay.
This is an interesting question, because our city council in Stockton actually deliberated on this issue a couple of days ago, and we'll pick this debate up next week. So this is a very timely topic with regard to warehousing in particular. And I think it's an interesting one, because I think it's one that splits traditional economic development and EJ right down the line. And I think this is where, the state sort of came in and said, hey, there needs to be a different way of thinking about this. And so now the community is actually actively grappling with this issue. And I don't know if there's a pithy set of feedback or counsel to give on that topic. But what I will say is that folks are really grappling with challenges around everything up to and including pollution and the pollution impacts on communities that are impacted that live proximate to warehousing. And there's also economic development groups that are grappling with power infrastructure requirements, and sort of what does it mean to put solar on top of a warehouse, and can PG&E and can the state actually keep up with sort of the grid component of that. So it's a really complicated topic, and I think both the economic development stakeholders and EJ are working through this in real time in Stockton. And it's really, I think it's a pollution, it's a public health issue, it's a power infrastructure question all rolled into one. And it's getting messy. And I think it has to get messy before it gets clear, but it's one that I think it's the tip of the iceberg here. And I think then sets the tone for all these conversations around hydrogen, around carbon, around all the infrastructure that needs to be built here in the Central Valley in particular, where there's been disproportionate impacts of air pollution.
Great, thanks. And so then maybe just generalizing that out is, if based on your experiences, what advice you would give to community members or community-based organizations as they approach community benefits agreements.
Well, I can speak more from like we have not been engaged in that. I know that one of our partners did develop a list of policy strategies that could be used to ensure that as investments coming in, that there's, that the benefit is to community, right? And then so I know that that's still an area that the Southeast is working on. I think for us, the way that we're approaching how we can even have these conversations is by engaging elected officials, city staff with nonprofits to really start creating that space where they can have like very honest and transparent conversations around like what their priorities are. Because I think part of what we're experiencing, right, our cities are very small. And then so one of the biggest issues that they're experiencing is a capacity issue, right? And then so, both at the elected official area, but, most of our elected officials work full-time. We have a number of them that are actually educators. So they really are elected officials, right, after they're done teaching. So that has an impact, right? It's not like the city of LA in LA County where like there's a full-time council. And then so I think that also has an impact on whether we can even have conversations with them, right? Because some of them are teaching, right? And then so that's an area where we're definitely seeing, we're doing a lot more, and even with the Gateway COG, right, like engaging city staff around like how do we see an opportunity to actually work together, because we all want to help community, but we have different priorities, right, in certain areas. And then so how do we start having these conversations in a way that's like supportive, and then so that's our role as a regional convener. Just I think as one of our colleagues said, like bringing a lot of voices that are typically not at the same table together, and really kind of facilitating that dialogue in a way that's respectful and that really kind of meets, helps us move the conversation forward versus like, creating this like combative space.
And I don't know, Karen, do you have specific advice you would offer?
I would say I have more maybe global observations rather than advice, but and this is more from the perspective like Dr. Franco was saying from the convener, but having a really clear strategy for engagement that's objective, so that we're not necessarily in our outreach responding disproportionately to either squeaky wheels or to well-resourced organizations that have the ability, whether they're a tribe or a county, to provide public input, so that they're not disproportionately being represented in the strategies. I mean, in the North Coast, for example, we have tribes that have incredible resources and some tribes that have almost none. And same with counties. We have counties going bankrupt and then well-heeled counties like Sonoma County. So we need to really be thoughtful and objective about the nature of the outreach. And then I really appreciated the comments about how do we support engagement with whether that's food or stipends or slowing down. And then also how do we incentivize engagement? Because the person who talked about engagement fatigue, it's like if you're just being constantly, there's so much money in the system right now, and every single nonprofit and entity that has gotten some of that funding that includes community engagement with economically challenged or otherwise underserved communities, understandably as it should be, but they're all knocking on the doors of the same tribes, the same NGOs, and it's overwhelming. And so I think we have a responsibility as entities that are asking for this outreach to coordinate with one another thoughtfully and to collaborate and to not overtax people or entities. And then also to really look at it objectively and say, what's going on in the landscape? Who have we not heard from? How do we make sure that we do hear from them so that it's not just kind of grabbing the low-hanging fruit in terms of people that have time to provide feedback?
Great. And Anne or Kate, do you have advice you would like to share as we're reaching the end of our time?
I mean, only again, I think not really advice. Just one note is I think we all really would love to see a move toward more of these being really negotiated and enforceable, because it also goes to the earlier question, Louise, you asked, where if they're separately negotiated and enforceable, there's an enforcement mechanism that's built in that the community or the workers or whoever has already agreed to. So that's really important because it allows accountability. Doing that, though, requires kind of having people at the table who represent the community. And I think that's really can be tricky. I really appreciated, I think it was Wilma who had this slide, or maybe Karen, on the partnership structure. If you have an existing organization that's done the work to create a partnership structure where you sort of have a sense of representation, then that can be really helpful getting to that table, because I've seen a lot of these break down literally just around the question of representation on the community side. So I do think that's really, really important to think through. And then you're in a better position to come to the table with like a real ask for something that's negotiated and enforceable at the end of the day.
Great.
Oh.
And any final words? Yeah.
Yeah, I'll just chime in on Kate's last point. I will give a shout out to the Department of Energy. I think one of the programs in particular, the Communities Leap Initiative, really set the table for Stockton in a way that put community at the center of decision making relative to national labs that were engaged, relative to industry that was trying to engage in a meaningful way, and that has changed the power dynamic locally. In a really substantive, long-term way. So I think that's how government can show up, and I think the way that philanthropy can show up is to resource and make sure there's supportive civic infrastructure, so that you actually have nonprofits that have the technical know-how to even talk to the Department of Energy, and that hasn't existed. And so I think that you need both sides to kind of come together, and I think we're in a really unique moment to start to unbreak old mental models.
Great. Well, thank you all so much. This has been a really great conversation. I think there's many, many more questions that we could be discussing, but just want to say thank you all so much. And for everyone who attended, we will send the recording around, we'll share the slides, and we can also compile some notes. And then also, I know there were a number of programs that were mentioned here and there, so we'll try to sift through and provide links and resources to those as well. But thank you all so much.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks to those listening.
Thanks, everyone.